So for those who are just logging on,
There we go.
today we were planning on doing a supplemental broadcast about aspects of the last chapter. And I'm still hearing a little bit of an echo, Greg. Part 3, Chapter 2, The Utopia of Greed, which we didn't get a chance to discuss in our broadcast on Tuesday, in part because it is such a deep and rich chapter. And there was just more that we could talk about possibly in 2 hours, but also because we had some technical difficulties on Tuesday, which were inherent in the nature of our setup, which we won't be experiencing today since we're both at home in a relatively controlled environment.
So let's begin. So our plan for last time was we were going to spend the first part of the session talking about Dagny Taggart's return to the world, her decision to return to the world, and we spent a lot of time on that, which was I thought we had a lot of good discussion of it. Then we moved to the topic of talking about Dagny's relationships to Galt and Francisco and the nature of those relationships. I think we said most of what we wanted to say about that, although if there are thoughts or questions people have on it online, or Ben, if you have any thoughts we didn't get to, we can talk a bit about them. And then what we didn't really get to was the philosophical principles that come out from those decisions and that are present in some of Dagny and Galt's discussions in the Valley. And so I'd like us to spend as much time as we can today on those. And then that leads to some more reflection on the way of life in the Valley and what it represents to Dagny, what it means to her, which is something we talked a little bit about under the heading of, it was one of the factors in her decision that this Valley meant so much to her. So I don't know, Ben, did we get any comments coming into this call or anything now on the chat that things we want to add to our agenda, or maybe things about the relationship stuff that we might want to do at the beginning?
I did put up a thread asking people for new thoughts, new questions about the same chapter, but I didn't get any takers on that one. So
right. C'est la vie.
Maybe somebody who's watching today will still have something they want to add. There are some people I see who are logged on, so they should start to let us know what they want to talk about. But I mean, we have stuff we can talk about on our own, that's for sure.
Of course. You know what's interesting about the comment viewer, Ben? In the comment viewer, I'm getting the comments from people, but it's not saying who they are. I'm getting not.
Yeah, this has been a problem for a couple of weeks now. It says NA.
I haven't had that before. So anyway, I've got the video up in another window, and so that's another way to view it. All right, Anne says no echo. Daron says no echo. Laura. Okay, so Ben, why don't you take it away, so to speak?
Well, I'm not sure if there was something you wanted me to take it away with, but I do have something that was weighing on me last week, which I was eager to talk about but didn't have time to. And this is actually going to maybe serve as a segue from the stuff that we talked about, we did have time to talk about last time, to the stuff that we're planning on talking about tonight. Most of what we talked about last time was the romantic and personal conflicts and the decision that Dagny had to make when she was, and I'm still hearing this, so I'm going to have to take my headphone out for a second, when she had to leave the Valley. And given the amount of time that we spent talking about that, it struck me, and this is a point that I've wanted to push for a long time about this book, that, and you maybe even heard me say this before, that a lot of people think this book is about the conflict between the creative producers like Dagny and Reardon and the mooching looters. And of course, it is about that to some extent, but there's so much more going on in this book, and so much more that's important. And you really start to see that in that last chapter, where Dagny's in this utopia, and she chooses to leave, and it has to do with a very deep conflict that she's been dealing with over the course of the book. And just out of morbid curiosity, the same morbid curiosity that I've had throughout this whole course, whenever I've gone to one of our favorite critics of the book to see what they have to say about this chapter, I was especially interested to know what were they going to say to criticize the utopia of greed, given that I thought there was so much in this chapter that was surprising and not in fitting with the typical stereotypes that you hear about the book. And, would they have picked up on any of these conflicts? And I guess I wasn't too surprised to find out that they didn't. And so, for example,
conflicts. Oh, go ahead.
I mean, I think the juiciest stuff is the examples of the stuff that they talk about instead.
Well, I'm not sure
by contrast.
What you have in mind by what they talk about instead.
I mean, I'm talking
one conflict that.
Let me finish the point. Let me finish the point. So here's the stuff that they thought worthy of comment about this chapter. First, they were refreshed to find out that there was actually some disagreement going on in the Valley. What was the disagreement they thought was interesting? Galt and Francisco disapproved of Ragnar's being a pirate. True. Not the biggest disagreement in the chapter.
Although it is
also, Dagny it is an interesting one. Also, Dagny has the same moral code as Galt and the rest of the strikers. So why does she decide to leave? This critic said it's a plot hole that they inserted into the book, that Rand inserted into the book just so that she could draw out the story. And then why does Galt give Dagny this job offer when she has no qualifications to serve as a maid? Out of the goodness of his heart? That seems out of character. Why aren't there more women in the Valley? And wouldn't there be terrible jealousy over the few that there are, and all the men that there are? And of course, most importantly, how did they get oranges?
I didn't see the how they got oranges question, but we were chatting about that once ourselves. But a few thoughts. I mean, I think the questions about the question about why does Dagny disagree if she has the same moral code is a really important question put one way. It's a question that you need to address to really understand the book. But the idea that she shouldn't disagree with them about anything if she has the same moral code comes from the premise that you're interpreting the book as these people are just walking philosophical codes. There's nothing more to them, and being resistant to evidence that there's more to the book than that, right? Because there is evidence here that there's more to the book than that. Deron says they have oranges, I think, because they manipulate the climate, and I think the fact that they have, this machine that can give them unlimited energy would, used well, might reduce all kinds of crop yields.
Or they just get them from Ragnar.
Or they get them from Ragnar, who's an importer, and we're told that he does that. Deron says greenhouses. The critical point, or whether it's a criticism or not, the question that I get a lot about this chapter, and Ben, you'll recall you and I talked about a acquaintance we know who was not particularly a fan of Rand, but was teaching this book in a university course, a course that I also taught the book in, spent a lot of his time in teaching it, and he didn't spend that much time, and it was just one book taught in a course that taught many others. When I did that same course, the book was a bigger part of it, but he focused almost entirely on, as I recall, why Dagny why Dagny falls for Galt, why she leaves Reardon so quickly. Is this realistic that somebody could do this? What does this show about the view of human relationships or love in the book? Is Dagny treating men as fungible and so forth? And we're getting not exactly that question, but a question on that same type of issue by Pooja, who puts it as, why is Dagny open to falling in love with Galt? So I'm taking it a premise in Pooja's question is, there are conditions she might have been in where she wouldn't have been open to falling in love with someone new, maybe a way in which she might have been committed to Reardon or to Francisco. But why is it that Daphne's not like that? And so she's in this state of openness and it falls in love with Call. So I think that's a significant question. And I think it's a non, I don't, I think there's a lot in this chapter and more than just that, and certainly in the book. So I don't think it's a great way to teach the book to just focus on that question. But I think it is a significant question. What's special about Galt? And is there something weird or inappropriate or too fungible in the view of love that all of a sudden Daphne sees this guy and now she knows she could never go back to Reardon? Now he's sort of it for her.
I mean, I agree completely that is an important question. And the way that your colleague was teaching it was already a lot deeper than I think the way a lot of people approach the book. And I mean, what's striking to me especially is that it's not just critics who miss these important conflicts. It's fans. And I think it's lots of the fans, like including the people who made a certain movie of this novel. None of this was in there. And that's pretty significant. I mean, and of course, when you do it that way and you just make it between the looters and the producers, it turns out to be a pretty boring story. That's as the critics of the movie noted.
Yeah, I mean, the people who made the movie didn't really know how to make movies in the first place and didn't know how to convert movies from books, and it was a rushed job, and so there's a lot of problems there that are separate from issues in understanding. Understanding, but yeah, I think a lot of people. So any faults with the movie we can also chalk up to there's a real skill, and it's hard to make movies. And if you try to just get a bunch of people who like a book, I mean, I don't think you and I can make a good movie out of this because we don't know how to make movies. But I think we get the book pretty well. So, but yeah, I think it is a lot is missed here, even by fans. Doron is raising the question of the children that we see in the Valley. That's another thing people often bring up. There were no children in Ayn Rand's book. There were no children in Atlas Shrugged. Let's hold off on that question, though, for a little bit.
I have some thoughts on that one.
So any thoughts on, I mean, I think we did talk quite a bit on the last call about why Galt is something special to Daphne, and why neither of her previous romantic relationships were ones that she was committed to, so to speak, to put it in terms of Pooja's openness question, right? I mean, Francisco was a boyfriend she had 12 years earlier, who the relationship ended under puzzling to her circumstances. And so why she doesn't feel committed to or with him, I don't think is such a question. In the case of Reardon, I mean, it's surely relevant that Reardon's married, though, as Carrie Ann has suggested, there's a way in which Daphne's been functioning like Reardon's wife, and they spend a lot of time together, but they haven't been tying their lives together in the way that you would a normal romantic relationship. And the fact that he's married and with someone else, even if he doesn't love her and she not him, is a part of the context for that relationship. And also the facts that make him in that relationship, right? That he thinks he owes certain things to Lillian, that he's acting out of pity at certain times, and the whole complex of issues and errors, some of which we've discussed, that lead Reardon to that is part of the context of that relationship. And so I don't think Daphne, I mean, in a sense, she feels like she's Reardon's woman or Reardon's mistress, but I don't think she takes it as a kind of commitment in that way. And also, she's, even apart from that, even before she got together with Reardon, she was cognizant from the beginning that there was something missing, that there was a kind of response she thought she could have to a man that Reardon wasn't, and that Francisco wasn't. And So she's always, in a certain sense, been spiritually holding out for something more, been holding something in reserve. That she knew these relationships, as good as they were, weren't satisfying. And now with Galt, and we talked about why, with Galt, she has that, or she feels that. And we've talked about the way in which Galt answers to several descriptions of something she's been looking for her whole life: the ultimate adversary, the man who can inspire her in the way that the inventor of the motor, which is a special way, inspired her, and so forth. Now, Daron asks if you can be exclusive with your mistress. Sure, the difference is not exclusivity that I'm thinking of, but commitment into the future. I mean, you can be exclusive with your girlfriend or your mistress, but that's not understood as an exclusive relationship for life, right? To go on into the indefinite future. When you start making plans with somebody that we're going to be forever together forever, normally you would get married, or you would do something else to signal, have a discussion to signal that this isn't just great here and now and we hope it continues, but it's something we're projecting forward through our whole lives.
And of course, Greg, there's one major thing that's stopping Reardon from doing that at this point in the book, and that's that he's still keeping this relationship with Dagny a secret. Yeah. And in the chapter we're talking about next week, we're going to find out more about the consequences of that and his latest thinking on it.
Benjamin says the right choice for her is Reardon. But why, Benjamin? What is it about her that makes Reardon the best man for her rather than Francisco or Galt? I mean, she has things in common with each of them. She thinks what she has in common with Galt is deeper and more important to her. What is it that you see in her or in Reardon that makes you think Reardon is the right one for her? I mean, I think
and even if you could answer that question, it would be a hard one to defend, because it's often not the case that we can understand what it is that makes somebody special romantic importance to another.
Right. I mean, if Dagny and Reardon and Galt were real people, and you were busy saying this to him, they would, say, screw you, butt out. This is our lives. But Francisco, at least, thinks it's more than that. He thinks he can see, knowing Dagny and Galt probably better than anybody does, and knowing Reardon pretty well, right? Why they belong together in a way that the others don't. And I think the book is written to suggest that as much as you can with a character who we've just met, although, of course, he's been in the background for the whole time.
And Greg, Benjamin is commenting here to the effect that, well, aren't Reardon and Dagny equal, or maybe he means Reardon and Galt are equal. But I think that gets to the point that you've been pushing for a while now, and it's related to what we were just discussing about conflicts, that these are really individualized characters, and they're not all made to be the same person and therefore indistinguishable just by virtue of the fact that they've got the same moral code on some level. And that's something people miss.
And in what sense are they equal? I mean, they're all fully committed to what they believe to be right, so in that sense, they're all morally equal. They have different understandings of what's right, and so Galt is correct by Galt's, at least, estimation, in a way that Dagny and Reardon aren't, and from Dagny's perspective, Reardon and her are correct in a way that Galt isn't, right? But she's wavering on that, and so is Reardon. They're not equal in their achievements. Dagny's really good at running and designing a railroad, which is a great achievement. She's a very capable person. But Reardon is a tremendous business person too, and also the inventor of a revolutionary new metal. So Reardon is significantly more accomplished than Dagny is. They're not equal in that respect. And Galt is history's greatest philosopher, theoretical physicist, and inventor, all rolled and political movement leader, all rolled into one. So he certainly surpasses Reardon in accomplishment. And Reardon, just based on his motor, says that Galt is the type of man that's born, mind that's born once in a century. So
it's also not just
gradation of
achievement.
ability.
it's not just the Galt's achievements that Dagny's falling in love with, right? It's his individual soul. And that's one of the things we get the biggest emphasis on in part 3, chapter 1, what makes him distinct and what makes his personality and his emotional reactions distinct. And these are definitely not the same as Reardon's. I mean, Reardon has had this kind of undertone of pain and struggle in his psychology that, you know, as he's struggled with this mind-body dichotomy, which you certainly don't see in Galt. And that's not just because of Galt's, you know, philosophical erudition. It's because of choices he's made over the course of his life, presumably.
Yeah,
Which
and
doesn't
just
make
his
Reardon bad, but it means that they've had a different life that's led them to this point.
and just Galt's style, right? So the you can believe the same things and be equally convinced of them even, and just different ones could be more like pronounced in your personality or your way of viewing the world. You have a different value slant on the world. And the way Galt sees it, I mean, Dagny represents the union of luxury, enjoyment on the one hand, and its causes in work on the other, right? So intellectual work production and enjoyment of life and the merge of those two, and that those two things belong together. And that has always been something that's been important to Dagny and part of her take on life and her whole view of life and what she wanted out of life and the kind of joy she took in sex and in parties or wanted to find in parties but couldn't. And all of that was part of, you know, I produce the world that I want and I enjoy it. Reardon's, and that's been that shaping the world in the image of her values, not settling for anything less. Values that she wants and enjoys has been kind of central to Dagny's whole view of life from the beginning. And then central to her conflict in life from the beginning is that somehow that's not happening. She does the work but doesn't get the rewards, doesn't find she enjoys it. Well, Galt's the person who also from the beginning has been thinking that these two things belong together and who solved the problem of that something seems to be pulling them apart in the world. He's the first one who said in which manner these things are inseparable, that is, work and enjoyment. And so in that sense, Dagny and Galt have a very deep bond. Now, Reardon, on the other hand, is someone who's always been productive, who's been a great worker, who did want his work to bring him happiness, who did know that the gold that he wanted was meant to, you know, that he made was meant to turn into anything he wanted it to turn into, but who from the beginning wasn't very clear on what he wanted. And he's now become more clear. He's now learned it from his relationship with Dagny. But he's not
And
someone
Francisco.
who was, yeah, and from Francisco. But especially in this point through Dagny, that is learning what to enjoy himself. But from Francisco that he has the right to, but from Dagny, you know, actually doing it. This Reardon is very production focused, hasn't been very enjoyment focused, even though he thinks he should enjoy himself and he accepts it and is coming to be more focused on it. Dagny's always been about the kind of union of those two, about purposiveness, and purposiveness, the purpose being your own joy. That's always been central to Dagny's character, and Galt is the one who speaks to that most. And it's not that he speaks to it most intellectually, that's also what he's about in the same way. Also very central to Dagny and also, I think, to Hallie, it's in some of the other characters too, but these are where you see it most, is this, the importance to them of this point that suffering is unnecessary, it shouldn't have to happen, and that Galt represents more than anything else. And there's a certain pride of person in Galt that's distinctive. It's not just, I mean, Benjamin thinks that people in love should be equals, and Dagny and Reardon are equals. Again, there are different senses of equality, and in some senses they're more equal, in some senses one or the other is better, but people in love don't have to be equals in that sense. No one's equal in every respect, and hardly anyone's equal in any respect, other than, you know, whether they're equally morally good or in their rights. But love isn't about finding someone who's just as good as you or just as something as you on some dimension. It's finding someone who you resonate with in a certain way. And there's this resonance between Galt and Dagny in a way and to a degree that there isn't between Dagny and the others. And you're now saying that maybe the choice to be with Galt is showing Dagny shifting to be enlightened. Well, that can't be exactly right because Dagny still doesn't choose to be with Galt in the sense of joining the strike, which would be the full enlightenment, having learned what she has to learn from Galt, right? And yet she is now head over heels in love with Galt. Galt's the one she wants in a way she's never wanted anyone else. And she knows that she can't go back to Reardon now that she knows Galt's in the world and has met him. So there are two things going on with Dagny. There's her coming to accept the strike, which if she eventually does, would be her becoming enlightened by Galt's lights, right? And of course, we don't know if she eventually does that yet. It could be that Galt comes around to her side or they remain adversaries. But that would be the move that would represent enlightenment. But that hasn't happened yet. But something has happened, such that she's now, her romantic circuits, so to speak, are fully committed to Galt. All right, so that's, I think, what we want to say about Galt and Dagny. So there's been a few other comments coming up. Duron is talking about Dagny's desire to look up to Galt. I mean, in a way, she's looked up to all three of these men at different times and still does, right? She admires Francisco tremendously and admires...
And I was going to say, Greg, that especially as to the question of how they could, whether love is always between equals, I mean, that can't be the case if love is at least often between men and women, because men and women are very different, and it's part of Ayn Rand's view of sexuality that whatever you think of this view, that feminine, that being feminine involves looking up to a man in a certain respect. And it's a controversial view, but
there's an equality that's compatible with that. But it's a non-identity in any case.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's. Who would Galt truly want, but does she fit the bill? Well, I mean, Galt, as he's written, truly wants Dagny, right? And he's wanted her now for 10 years, I think. Pooja asked, and she asked online, whether Galt suggests that Francisco's pain in regards to Dagny is greater than his. Is it? Why? Well, note also Francisco says the opposite, right? You say, I've suffered the most for this strike, implying that it's not him at the end, but that it's Dagny or Galt or both.
Well, they don't actually say suffer or pain. They say paid the most.
Paid the most, yeah.
And that's going to connect to a big topic we're going to discuss later tonight. I think it's a mistake to assume it means suffering. Don't you think?
Is it paid in each case? Is it paid when Galt says it to Francisco, too?
Let me see.
I don't think it's suffered. I think you're right. But paid, given up, suffered, I'm not sure what verb he uses.
I'm having trouble finding it. Some of it is on page 769 of the.
Well, look for the pity where it says pity, John. If you
that's
search
that's 769. Whatever any of us has paid for this battle, said Galt, you're the one who's taken the hardest beating, aren't you? That's what Galt says.
Hardest beating. Okay, so that's a different verb. But I mean, I think what's going on in this exchange, there's more to say, which we'll talk about when we talk about the greed stuff, and you want to talk about later, is both Galt and Francisco are very aware of the value of Dagny, right? So they have a very strong personal awareness of how much she's worth, what it would mean to give her up, what it would be like to be maintaining a hope that you can have her over a long period of time when you're not sure that you can, what it would be like to watch her decide to go back to the world and decide to risk your life to go back and give her a way back. They're each very aware of, in a uniquely personal way, because they each love her, of what it feels like, what it is to love her, and what it's like to have to fight her in the knowledge of that. And so they're, and to risk, and then to not know whether you're going to be with her. And so I think each of them is very aware of the suffering that the other goes through because he's been through a version of it.
Do you want to shift to talking about some of the philosophical issues?
Yes, absolutely. Let's do that. And some of these, of course, come up in connection with the conflict between Galt and Dagny. Do you want to start with the first one we had on our list?
Well, I didn't flesh that one out, so I was thinking you were going to, but I could try to wing it.
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, I'm happy to. If
So this is the no faking reality part, and I'm trying to remember the first place this comes up. But it's continuous with a lot of what happened in the previous chapter, where we had a lot of this emphasis on Galt's sight and his value, the value he places in seeing, and the various times where he basically makes Dagny look at something that she seems uncomfortable looking at, like Francisco's cabin, or the ways in which he says, "I'm the one who took all these men from you." And likewise, in this chapter, he's often stressing that nobody stays in this valley without faking reality in any way, whatever.
Two really key passages here, right? So the first time we get that language is when Galt, Francisco, and Dagny are together touring Francisco's mines, and this is the first time Galt's seen it in a year, the first time Dagny's seen it at all, and they're considering this idea of maybe Dagny could make a railroad up there, and Dagny kind of breaks down as she's thinking about, to see what happens.
Yes, page 794.
Good, and
you'll have to hear about it.
Go ahead.
You'll have to hear about it with his ruthless tone, peculiarly his, which sounded implacable by being simple, devoid of any emotional value, save the quality of respect for facts. And then you'll hear about the whole course, the last agony of Taggart Transcontinental. You'll hear about every wreck. You'll hear about every discontinued train. You'll hear about every abandoned line. You'll hear about the collapse of the Taggart Bridge. Nobody stays in this valley except by a full conscious choice based on a full conscious knowledge of every fact involved in his decision. Nobody stays here by faking reality in any manner, whatever.
And so what this occasion, this is Dagny said, if only I could stay and didn't have to hear about it, didn't have to know when it goes. And then Galt responds with this. One thing that's interesting is that I've made the point in the past that we don't get explicit philosophical principles expounded, like in little speeches, until after we've seen a lot of instances of that principle and seen it kind of had the occasion to induce it from the novel. And Ben, as you were pointing out, in the last chapter, we don't have Galt say things like nobody fakes reality in any manner whatsoever, but we see him what now that we have these terms, we can say is we see conspicuous examples of him not faking where other people would. We see the effects of that on Dagny, right? So she's trying to spare him pain by withholding the accusation that you took these men from me. I think these are the men I lost, and he throws it back at her and says, "No, the true fact is I took them from you," and he made a boast of it. And we see it again in their first night together scene, not first night sleeping together, but first night in the house, where he stresses all the facts that are relevant to her decision. So we've seen that this is something Galt does, that he presses the truth and presses, notice this is relevant. You can't ignore this or push it out of mind. And now we're seeing him say, this is what I do, right? And this is how we have to be, and this is how you have to be in this valley. And he's doing it in a situation where Dagny can now see this as typical of him, and also can appreciate from seeing how it's worked for him that this is the source of his serenity, that this is the source of him being this kind of person he is, which she so loves. And so she appreciates it as really significant. So this is the first of these lines. And then the second one is just later in this same scene, right? So we get in this scene the Dagny's test of Galt. Ben, just to pause, we're getting, Mari is pointing out that we don't have the link for this video on the main page yet. And there are people...
The main page of what?
I assume she means the Atlas Project group page. And it looks like there are people scattering around there looking for it or something. Thanks,
Sorry
Maria, for telling us that. Look at the comments while we're here. Pooja thinks our comments make up for the technical difficulties. I hope we're doing our best. Benjamin's talking about the that Dagny and Reardon's relationship started with a lie, and what's the role of that in the relationships not becoming the love of Dagny's life. Good question. Maybe we can take that up a little bit more when we talk about chapter 3, where we get Reardon's perspective on that relationship and on the lies, on the faking of reality. And it's interesting, I don't think it's a spoiler, that in chapter 3 we find Reardon now speaking in terms of faking reality, which he couldn't have learned from Galt directly because he hasn't met Galt, and he hasn't, Francisco and Ragnar haven't used this language with him, so he's come to this identification independently of them. So that's interesting, and also I guess it's a giveaway to one of the questions we were asking in our questions about chapter 3. Good, I just saw Ben the post come up. So the first instance of the language of faking reality, right, is this scene where Dagny says, "I could." If only I didn't have to hear about it, I could stay here. And Galt says, in fact, that would be faking reality. Nobody stays in this valley by faking reality in any manner whatsoever. The next scene, or the next instance of this, which is later in that same scene, is that Dagny tries to, Francisco invites Dagny to spend the last week with him, rather than with Galt, rather than at Galt's house. And Dagny tries to push the decision off to Galt.
That's page 798 of the standard edition where the decision gets made, or leading up to that. And there's another mini speech that happens on the basis of it that connects to our next major philosophical topic, incidentally.
Let me just check one other thing before we go to that. There's one other use of this language that I can remember in the chapter, which is a little later, and it might be good to just turn to that before we turn to the other usage of it in the mind scene, which is faked reality. So the other example of it in the chapter is Dagny says to Galt, "You want to hold me here, don't you?" And Galt responds, "More than anything else in the world." And she says, "You could hold me." And his response is, "I know it." But then he regains his breath, and when he spoke, his voice was low and clear, with some stressed quality of awareness, which was almost the quality of a smile of understanding. Let me pause before reading what he says. That's a very characteristically Galt kind of expression. That's not how Francisco or Reardon or anybody else would be in this moment, I think. Francisco,
what's the page,
in
by the
moments
way?
like this, I'm reading it in the CD-ROM, so I don't have the page number. But if you look up on the Kindle Faked Reality, you'll find it. So he waited to regain his breath. This is difficult for him, right? When he spoke, his voice was low and clear with some stressed quality of awareness. So what he turns to when he's having difficulty, right, when something's hard for him, is this commitment to focusing on reality. That's what he takes, what he recharges in, so to speak. With this stressed quality of awareness, it's your acceptance of this place that I want. What good would it do me to have your physical presence without any meaning? That's the kind of faked reality by which most people cheat themselves of their lives. I'm not capable of it, he turned to go. And neither are you. Good night,
Greg, that's actually earlier in the chapter than the mine scene that we were talking about. Yeah.
Really? Oh, thanks, Ben. I was wrong. So
that's page 780.
So that then is the first usage of this language of reality being faked. And then we get the principle later, which is nobody stays in this valley by faking reality in any manner whatsoever.
Yeah, that's the first one is when they're still in Galt's cabin, and there's he's struggling to leave the living room or to not leave the living room, and then it ends with the cigarette lighter.
Yes, good. So he's struggling not to sleep with her too early, right? Basically.
And so this explains why there's a struggle, because he thinks that if he were to sleep with her, he would be faking, because it would be her physical presence, but it wouldn't have the meaning.
And if he were to hold her, and for people who know The Fountainhead, there's a parallel, very similar scene in The Fountainhead. Not exactly the same, but
Clayton, Ohio?
Something similar. Yeah, Clayton, Ohio. Which is actually one of the couple of scenes that was done pretty well in the Fountainhead play. I mean, several scenes were done well, but it was one of the better bits of the play. For those that's a whole other thing. There was a theatrical production in New York, and you can, if you Google me and Fountainhead play, you'll find the panel on it where Shoshana and Anne and I discuss it. Okay. So yeah, but let's go back to the other scene, and it's now the second. Thanks, Ben, for correcting me on the order. So we see Galt doing this, looking to the facts a lot in places where other people wouldn't in Chapter 1. We see this instance of it in Chapter 2, where he uses the expression faked reality, and what he's doing is not faking reality, refusing to fake reality. And then we get his stating the principle, nobody stays in this valley by faking reality in any manner whatsoever, when she says, if only I didn't have to know. And that faking reality question, right, is really there in two ways in that second scene, because she knows that Galt wants her to stay more than anything, right? This is what he wants most. And it's not even like he'd lock her up or say you have to stay and just get her physical presence. All he'd have to do is spare her some of the pain of knowing some of what's happening, the details of what's happening to Taggart Transcontinental as it's happening. And he's saying that would be faking on her part, and he won't let her do it. But also for her to let her stay without knowing that, right, would be him faking that she's got the attitude towards their cause and towards the outside world that he and the other strikers have. But for her to be there without having that would be, just her physical presence. So that would be faking reality. I'm blushing because Benjamin's writing nice things about us. So let's move to this this second instance of it, right? Which is Ben. Do you want to just read us that bit, because I'm not at it now, and maybe to set up that scene a little bit.
Second instance of faking reality.
Yeah.
Or it comes up actually shortly after the one that we were just talking about. Actually, I think you mean the third instance, because we've talked about two already. So there's the one where they're in the mining scene, Galt's apartment. Yeah, the second one is in the mining scene, and then the third one is actually, I'm not sure if they're still in the mine. I think they've now moved back.
They're walking home from the mine.
Right.
I think. Yeah.
And this is they're walking home, and this is where the test comes up. And Galt says, you had to put me to a test in order to learn whether I'd fall to the lowest possible stage of altruism. She did not answer, but looked at him in open, undefensive admission. He chuckled and looked away, and a few steps later said slowly in the tone of a quotation, nobody stays here by faking reality, and then it's italicized, in any manner whatever. And then he goes on to explain more about, well, she actually thinks about what it would mean for him to have sacrificed this. And she thinks about how his decision not to make this sacrifice contrasts with the outer world. And this is in part what leads her to now see the real difference in the people in the valley versus the outside world, where she thinks about how you can deal with men as clear, as firm, and firm as sun and rocks here, in contrast to her attitude in Woodstock. And that's where Galt then gives a speech about conflict of interests.
Yeah, one thing, even before we get to the speech about conflict of interest, just about the dynamic between Galt and Dagny that's interesting. They if you look at the different conversations between pairs of heroes, positive characters, in the novel, you see they have different vibes and dynamics. There's the underlying thing between Francisco and Reardon whenever they talk is this tremendous respect, right, on both sides, or at least from Francisco to Reardon, and this growing appreciation and need on Reardon's part for Francisco, but also just this tremendous and grudging respect for him. And so you get the sense of two titans who kind of respect each other. And I think somebody named that scene when they're looking out the window earlier, Titans at the Window, at least when a manuscript page from it or a reproduction of one was auctioned off, that was the phrase that was used, and it's a good phrase. And I think you see something similar in the scene with Ragnar and Reardon. And Ragnar is sort of functioning as a stand-in there for Francisco, and he says, you know, I came to you because my friend couldn't, and we know that that's Francisco. When you look at Galt and Reardon, there's a very different dynamic. Even when, Dagny and Reardon, even when Dagny's trying to teach Galt something or she sees something Galt doesn't and wants, Reardon doesn't and wants him to understand it, there's a very different dynamic, and we could talk about what it is at some point if someone wants to. But there's a different, just a different style to the Galt Dagny interactions, even when they're pedagogical in a way that the Francisco to Reardon interactions are. And it's a little hard to put your finger on it. I mean, part of it is the different personal character, but part of it's a different intellectual style to both Galt and Dagny. And one thing that that comes to mind when I think about it is my old professor and dear friend Alan Godhelf, who's since passed away, and who was an Aristotle scholar, used to say that there's a certain speed to Aristotle, a certain kind of pace at which the thoughts come, a certain kind of size of the connections that he'll comment on. And he won't comment on every small, minor connection. He'll leave you to fill in those gaps yourself. And, sometimes there are disputed passages where it's not clear if this was written by Aristotle or someone else. And one thing that Alan thought was you can think about in judging that is, does this feel like the kind of pace and speed at which Aristotle's mind works, which from, having read a lot of him. And if you look at the conversations between Galt and Dagny, first of all, Galt speaks in these very abstract connections. They're concretized because he'll say, like, this is the Taggart terminal. He'll talk about specific events, but the kinds of ways by which he gets from one point to the next, in which he sees this thing implies that or this thing is relevant to that, involve very wide-scale abstractions. And that's characteristic of Galt, but especially when he's talking to Dagny. It's more so there than, for example, in the speech we'll see Galt gives later. And Dagny's also doing a tremendous amount of processing on her own. So Dagny says to Galt, puts him through this test, and then he, a little bit later, that day, the next time they were alone together, says, "You had to put me to a test in order to learn whether I'd fall to the lowest possible rung of altruism." Okay, why it's altruism we could see. Will he give up something he loves, Dagny, for his friend? Or will he sacrifice her for his friend? So I could see that connection. Then nobody stays here by faking reality in any manner whatever. Now, why sacrificing is an issue of faking reality, it's not obvious. That's a pretty big connection to draw. And then we see Dagny immediately draws the connection, right? And so the intensity of her relief is, and she goes through this whole mental process that takes paragraphs of reinterpreting what it would have been for him to make this sacrifice, all in terms of faking reality, which we've not seen in the novel before, which is really interesting, which is philosophically, I think, unique to Rand and really striking. And Dagny has this thought herself, just prompted by Galt's connecting the issue of will he sacrifice to will he fake reality. And then what Galt does is brings up what you might think is a totally different issue, but obviously connected both to this issue of sacrifice and this issue of faking, and to Galt's understanding the kind of connections that Dagny must have been making in that moment. Did it ever occur to you, Miss Taggart, that there was no conflict of interests among men? Neither in business, nor in trade, nor in their most personal desires, if they omit the irrational from their view of the possible and destruction from their view of the practical. And this is the next principle we want to talk about. But just the idea of moving from those three things, that's really unusual as a style of speech and thought. It's way faster than the pace of the kinds of conversations between Francisco and Reardon. And part of it's just where we are in the novel and what the readers are prepared to take in, or what the author hopes the readers are prepared to take in. But part of it is, Galt has a very different style of thought and style of conversation, and so does Dagny, and this is how they mesh. All right, so we want to move now to this issue of faking reality. That was our next big philosophical
conflicts of interest.
Conflicts of interest. That was the next big philosophical principle we wanted to talk about. And as I recall, we had some comments you wanted to draw people's attention to from the discussion forum connected to that.
Yeah, well, we asked why did Galt and Axton think that there need be no conflict among people or among persons' desires? How did this view apply to the actual and potential conflicts in the chapter? And we definitely had some good comments from people identifying what some of these conflicts were. Amber points out, for instance, that there's a major conflict in Dagny's wanting Galt, but also wanting to run her railroad, go back to the world. And David says that it looks like David points to the conflict that there seems to be between Francisco and Galt, of course, over Dagny. But so why is there no conflict? I mean, these would seem to be, and it's in asking this question the way that we did, Greg, it helped me to think more about the significance of this issue, because I had always in my mind thought of the conflicts of interest point as a separate one from the fact that people have an apparent conflict between what their reason tells them and what their emotion tells them. And I'd always known that the way that Ayn Rand addresses that is to say, well, when you think you have a conflict between reason and emotion, it's because there's really some kind of contradiction in your thinking, maybe between your implicit and your explicit thoughts. But I never thought to connect that with her view about conflicts of interest among different people. But when you think about it, it really does come to the same thing, because if there's a conflict between people, or something that looks like one, it's because somebody in the pair has got an internal conflict, in effect, or at least they're letting one of their assumptions go unchecked about
Well, it's
what
not
reality is.
obvious that one of them has to have an internal conflict for there to be a conflict between people. One of them could hold. I mean, so suppose you and I are competing for a single job, right? And neither of us has a conflict internally over whether he wants the job. And let's also, make it a situation in which we don't already know each other and we're not friends and I don't wish you well and we're just, strangers to each other, but we're both competing for the same job so that we don't add, I'll feel bad if you don't get it or whatever, or vice versa. Neither of us is in conflict, but you might think we have a conflict of interest. Now, Rand has a whole article on conflicts of interest, and she addresses, it's called The Conflicts, in scare quotes, of men's interests, and it's in The Virtue of Selfishness. And you can think of it as a kind of long development on what's going on in this passage by Galt. One thing to note there is that, let me see if anybody online is commenting on this now. One thing to connect there is what you don't have conflicts of interest unless you, thanks, Ben, that you're pulling it up. The idea that you get in The Virtue of Selfishness is that there are a bunch of factors that go into a rational person's values. So a rational person doesn't just want stuff and then regard what he wants as his interest, and then anything that prevents him from getting the stuff he wants is somehow in conflict with him. And if rather, a rational person takes into account reality and context when he's forming his desires. He thinks they have to be consistent with each other. He realizes that there's a kind of whole background context that makes the desires possible, and he thinks of that as part of what he's desiring. He desires things and evaluates them and decides whether he wants them in a context of understanding the world as a cause and effect type of system in which he plays a certain role, and so he realizes that he's going to have to exercise effort and take responsibility for getting what he wants. So it's not just, I want something, I don't know how I'm going to get it, and then anything that might result in my not getting it, like someone else's actions, is somehow at variance with me. And we see the same kind of thinking in what Galt says here, right? So he says there are no conflicts of interest among men, neither in business or in trade or in personal desires, if they omit the irrational from their view of the possible and destruction from the view of the practical. So the irrational from their view of the possible, they don't consider anything that would be a contradiction possible. And we'll see that what Galt views as a contradiction, it's not just, obvious cases of I desire to have my cake and eat it too, but cases where the causality involved in the two things you want makes it impossible to have one and not the other. And the person in this chapter who you really get explicating this point about what's possible and people who desire the irrational and think of the irrational as possible is Hugh Axton. And Hugh Axton talks a lot about this in connection with what it was that Robert Stadler wanted. And we can turn to that later, but there's a whole view about what counts as possible and what therefore is a fit object of desire. Because if something's not possible, it's not there to be desired. Okay, so in order to be in the situation where you don't have conflicts of interest, you have to be either within yourself or between yourself and others. You have to be somebody who omits the irrational from your view of the possible and omits destruction from your view of the practical. That's another big thought that we're going to have to think about. I don't know whether we'll go much into it here, but I think we'll see a lot of it when we see Daphne return to the world. Then there's no conflict, no call for sacrifice, and no man is a threat to the aims of the other. But no man's a threat to the aims of the other only, quote, if men understand that reality is an absolute not to be faked, that lies do not work, Well, why does he think lies do not work? We'll get more on that in his speech, and we'll get more of it from Reardon later. That the unearned cannot be had, and the undeserved cannot be given. That's a really deep. So what does it mean to say the unearned cannot be had? If it were true that something unearned couldn't be had or given, right, and the undeserved can't be given, if it were really impossible to have something unearned or to give something undeserved, then in any attempt to get the unearned or to give the undeserved, you would have to be faking reality. And you would have to be in a premise where you were taking something as irrational as possible. But what does it mean to say the unearned can't be had? I mean, don't people steal and they have? So this requires some thought. Ben, yeah.
Well, this is answered to some extent in the previous few paragraphs. We don't get the whole speech that we hear not only in the next chapter but in Galt's, but in the passage where Dagny is thinking about what it would mean for Galt to give her up for Francisco. You get something like the following. Galt, giving up the woman he wanted for the sake of his friend, faking his greatest feeling out of existence and himself out of her life, no matter what the cost to him and to her, then dragging the rest of his years through the waste of the unreached and unfulfilled. She, turning for consolation to a second choice, faking a love she did not feel, being willing to fake, since her will to self-deceit was the essential required for Galt's self-sacrifice, then living out her years in hopeless longing, accepting as relief from an unhealing wound some moments of weary affection, plus the tenet that love is futile and happiness is not to be found on earth. Francisco, struggling in the elusive fog of a counterfeit reality, his life a fraud staged by the two who were dearest to him and most trusted, struggling to grasp what was missing from his happiness, struggling down the brittle scaffold of a lie over the abyss of the discovery that he was not the man she loved, but only a resented substitute, half charity patient, half crutch, his perceptiveness becoming his danger and only his surrender to lethargic stupidity protecting the shoddy structure of his joy. It goes on, it's a long
So
sentence.
we get this beautiful example of it here, right? What Galt is giving us is the abstraction that it falls under, but we get this example of the unearned, in this case, would be Dagny's love, right? And in particular, there's a way in
Francisco hasn't earned it.
Right. There's a way in which he has earned it, in which she does love him and will always love him. But what is particularly being talked about is whether Francisco is the one for Dagny, and whether Dagny gives herself to him as the one, right? That she's going to marry or be with her, be her first choice. And that can't be given. It can only be faked. And Galt can't give it to Francisco. He can only encourage her to fake it. And if she does give it to Francisco or goes with Francisco, Francisco won't really have that. He won't really have what Galt has from Dagny. The response that Galt gets from Dagny it can't be transferred, and he can't have it. And that's what he would want in wanting her, and that's what she and Galt would want to give Francisco in giving her to him in this sense. Now, there are lots of other examples we get of this. And we get them from Francisco earlier in Francisco's money speech, because you might think that, right, so maybe you can't give love unearned or give up the woman you love for a friend you love and she'll love him. But why can't, so maybe unearned love can't really be had. But unearned money, I mean, you steal some money and you've got the money. Well, you didn't earn it. But we see in Francisco's speech the idea that if you just think of the money as like the stack of dollar bills, okay, you could have them undeserved. But the money isn't the stack of paper, right, or the numbers on an account balance. It's what that stands for, and the reason why you want it is because of the role that it plays in your life, what it comes from, what it enables you to do, and that can't be had unearned. And we have the whole speech where Francisco talks about that and talks about what these people are trying to do is reverse cause and effect.
And incidentally, I think it's interesting that the both of these passages are followed up by Galt's saying, "No one's happiness but my own is in my power to achieve or to destroy. You should have had more respect for him and for me than to fear what you had feared." So, I mean, this is emphasizing the point that you were making before, that, you know, what Francisco would want from Dagny is not her faking that he's her only love. And if he found that out, what's his reaction going to be? What? So you were pretending to love me when really you love somebody else? What do you think? I was some kind of fool who could be duped, or who couldn't stand to find this out about himself? I mean, he had earlier, right, stressed how don't treat me like I'm some kind of wound who can't be touched. And so this is, getting to the point that the kind of faking, I mean, Galt's talking about white lies at one point here. Maybe that's later in the next chapter, but there is this attitude that people have that when you tell a white lie, you're doing it for the sake of the other person whose feelings are going to be hurt. And Galt is here stressing, no, I mean, if you're lying to Francisco, there's actually a deeper sense in which you're not respecting him, and you're treating him as less valuable than he actually is to you.
Yeah, I think you're thinking of something Reardon says in the next chapter, but
which I was just reading.
And so we get the lies can't work, the unearned cannot be had, the undeserved cannot be given. The destruction of a value which is will not bring value to that which isn't. So faking Galt and Dagny's love out of existence won't make Dagny's feeling for Francisco what her feeling was for Galt. That feeling for Francisco was a lot, and it's still there, but it never was nor won't be what she feels for Galt. And pretending that Galt isn't what he is and isn't what he is to her won't make Francisco that thing. And then we get this now bringing it back to business, the businessman who wishes to gain a value by throttling a superior and so forth, and various other people who do the kinds of things that Rand talks about in that article, The Conflicts of Men's Interest, are not going to achieve what they claim they're after. What all they're doing is wishing facts out of existence, and destruction is the only means of their wish. And if they pursue it, they won't achieve a market, a fortune, or fame. They'll merely destroy production, employment, and art, and these are the three parallel examples. So that's why, Galt continues, quote, a wish for the irrational is not to be achieved. Interesting. A wish for the irrational is not to be achieved, whether the sacrificial victims are willing or not. So when you're trying to achieve the irrational, one, it can't be achieved, and the only way you can actually try to achieve it is by sacrificing someone. Either someone who willingly makes a sacrifice, and maybe that's you, you're willing to sacrifice yourself, or to ask someone to sacrifice willingly, or you're forcing someone and unwillingly sacrificing them, like duping Francisco into this situation or whatever, or like what's being done with directives out in the outside world. But so you get this kind of very tight connection between trying to achieve the unearned or the irrational, faking facts out of existence. It has to be accomplished by destruction/sacrifice, and those are the same things, and sacrifice is the giving up, the destroying of a value. And anyway, it won't work. But then, giving the end of Galt's paragraph, but men will not cease to desire the impossible and will not lose their longing to destroy, so long as self-destruction and self-sacrifice are preached to them as the practical means of achieving the happiness of the recipients. And that's part of what Galt's denying here. But it's really interesting, desiring the impossible and longing to destroy are very closely connected in Galt's mind. And we're going to have to see more about that as we proceed, about whether the people who desire the impossible really long to destroy things. We get an indication that they might here.
This came up a little bit already back when we were in the chapter after the chapter or two after the tunnel disaster, if you remember, when Taggart is sitting at his desk and he's thinking about whether he should submit this letter of resignation, and he's afraid of something, and it's not just the people in Washington that he's afraid of, and he's got this ball of hatred that's growing, and it's a hatred for Dagny, and presumably other people like her. And as that same hatred is flowing, you also see him wishing for destruction of, in effect, of his own company, because he wants it to be nationalized. And so there's something there that he's wishing out of existence, and in so doing, there's a kind of destruction he's wishing for.
Yeah, well, so wishing something out of existence should be wanting destruction. That's an easier connection, right? Because I mean, you want
Wishing
something to be
facts
out of existence. Well, what do?
Yeah.
You got to destroy it. But how is desiring the irrational or the impossible connected to wishing facts out of existence? Well, I guess you need to wish out of existence whatever facts make it impossible, or I think we'll see more because I think it's even deeper than that. It's not just some
Yeah.
one fact is preventing it, and we want to get that fact out of existence. I think as we start
The whole
to see,
reality that gives rise to that one fact.
yeah,
And the
it's
rules of that reality.
exactly, it's the fact that things have identity, and you'll notice that what the people like the board of directors and so forth, they're all described, the people that are Dagny's enemies and who she hates, as somehow against things having definite identities. And we'll see a lot more of that when we look at the chapters after Dagny returns from the valley. But you can see it here too in everything Axton says about Stadler, right?
Greg, maybe I wonder if, since we just talked about that, it might be better to skip ahead a bit to the cause and effect issue.
Oh yeah, because,
and then come back to because of the interconnectedness of reality.
Stuff. Yeah, sorry, Ben, you're referring, because just in case anyone's confused, we've got an outline of points we wanted to hit, and Ben saying switch the order of the next two, and I agree. So let's do that, and actually that might make for a better flow anyway, because the benevolent universe.
I'll switch it actually in the document itself, just
all right,
so that we.
So what we're moving on to is the kind of view of cause and effect that Galt holds, and that Axton in particular talks a lot about. And Ben, you have a lot of points to make on this, so why don't you take the
it's
helm
not always something that comes up in exactly those terms, cause and effect. I can't actually remember, Greg, if it comes up explicitly in those terms in this chapter, but on this latest reading of mine, I was really struck by how much it comes up in another form, and especially in the language of financial transactions, which is, I think, significant given the title of the chapter, and we'll come back to that toward the end. But there is constant emphasis placed throughout on the great costs and the great prices that various characters have had to pay for, to reach where they are now, and to get to be the kind of person who they are. So we talked about a little bit of it already earlier in the chapter when we were talking about, I think, Pooja's question. But so Francisco, Galt says that he's the one who's paid the most, who's taken the greatest beating. And then when on page 792, Dagny is reflecting on what Francisco has had to pay, and she's thinking about the moment when when Francisco was about to get in a fight with Reardon, and how it was Galt's image that had carried him through. And now we get the answer to that question of what was this point on the opposite side of the room that Francisco was focusing on that was helping him get to the greatest achievement that he had ever made in her thinking. And then some part of her felt a dim dread, the effort which Francisco had made in that moment to accept her loss in his rival as the payment demanded of him for his battle had cost him so much that he was now unable to suspect the truth Dr. Axton had guessed. So there's the prices that Francisco has paid. And Galt is described as having made important costs. So Dagny thinks of him as having paid an excruciating cost for the kind of smile that he has. We've talked about his smile in the past, kind of seriousness combined with a hint of humor. And later when at the end of the chapter, he's deciding whether or not he's going to go back into the world. He's putting it in these, not quite in these terms, but it has the same effect, where he's willing to take the risk of going back into the world because it's to get what he wants. But then especially
there's
when...
Also, there's also, isn't there a scene, I think it's here in this chapter, where Galt looks at something, or he has the attitude as if contemplating something bought, a treasured possession bought at an exorbitant cost. And I think it has to do with one of his memories of her or something.
I think that might have been the one about the smile that I was just referring to.
Okay.
Yeah, that was it. That's page 776 and 777, I think. But
a possession
then
at an excruciating cost. So that's not only the reason I put it is it's, well, maybe this is what you meant and what you said, but it's not just Dagny who sees it as his smile shows that he's paid such cost, but his smile shows that his memory and that Galt himself views what he's talking about as something that he purchased at this cost, right? So it's, and what it is his perspective on his first time seeing her, right? Because that's what he's smiling.
He's got this image in mind of her, and much of what he's done through the course of the novel has been motivated by that. Just like Francisco's image of Galt has motivated him, and then we have Dagny, who is described as, at one point when Galt is emphasizing again, every man that your railroad needed and lost in the past 10 years, it was I who made you lose him. His voice, this is 780, by the way, his voice had the single-toned flatness and luminous simplicity of an accountant who reminds a reckless purchaser that cost is an absolute which cannot be escaped. When he's struggling about whether to go into her room, and she's struggling about whether to go into his, she says to herself, let him come here, let him break, let it be damned, all of it, my railroad and his strike and everything we've lived by, let it be damned, everything we've been and are. He would, if tomorrow I were to die, then let me die, but tomorrow let him come, be at any price he names. So she's also thinking about the price that she would pay by being with him. And then I think we get to the
on that one point, for the people interested in the Reardon issue and Reardon versus Galt. Early on in, not that early, but on the scene after Jim and Cheryl's wedding, when Reardon and Dagny are talking, right, and she's talking about how their relationship is a trade. She says, if you asked me for more than I was willing to give, I wouldn't give it. If you asked me to give up the railroad, I would leave you. And it's not like it would be a hard choice, right? It's, if you asked me to give up the railroad, I would leave you. Well, that is what Galt is asking. And she's not ready to give it exactly, but in some moments she is, right? Any price. There's nothing I have that's not for sale to him any longer.
And I think the most significant case where this language is used is the passage that we ended our discussion on last week, the goblet scene, where Francisco gives the two goblets to Galt and Dagny, and she says, and this is after, of course, she's decided to go back, and or no, she hasn't decided. She has decided it, and she says, I have not earned it, and what you've paid, I'm paying it now, and I don't know whether I'll ever earn enough to hold clear title, but if hell is the price and the measure, then let me be the greediest of the three of them. So one of the questions that we had asked in the discussion was, what does she mean there by greed? And the title of the chapter, of course, is The Utopia of Greed. There's some connection now being drawn between being the greediest and being willing to pay an incredible price for something. And I think we still need to explore that a little bit more. But clearly throughout this series of uses of paying prices, there's an emphasis on there's a cause you need to bring about an effect, and anything you want, you've got to pay for. There's a line that Ayn Rand was a fan of, and she talks about it in another one of her nonfiction essays, Duty versus Causality. God said, take what you want and pay for it. And all of these characters are definitely pursuing what they want, but there's a big emphasis being placed on the fact that they've got to pay a price for it. Because reality is interconnected, and they can't have their cake and eat it too.
And she talks there
they would be faking otherwise.
In the essay, it's I think Causality versus Duty, and it's in the book Philosophy Who Needs It. I don't know if it's also up online from the Ayn Rand Institute. But anyway, it's in the book Philosophy Who Needs It. And she talks there about being a disciple of causality, right? And that's what she thinks the right way to be is, and the right perspective to have on virtues. And I think that essay, Causality versus Duty, very much goes along with the conflicts of men's interest, which is in the virtue of selfishness, as
It is online. I'll put a link to it in the comments section.
is the conflicts of men's interest online also? Those two essays, I think, really expound the kind of perspective on life and morality that we're getting from Galt and Axton in this chapter, and also from other characters from Dagny and so forth, and they're talking about paying for things. It's taking a causal perspective on your values, understanding that part of what it is for something to be a value is for it to be something that you think is possible. You think it's possible rationally, and
that one's up too. I'll put it in the comments.
And you're rationally acting to achieve it. A value is, as Rand defines it, as will later say Galt puts it, that which you act to gain or keep. But to act to gain or keep something, you have to think it's possible, and you have to be acting for it. And since reason is the faculty by which we figure out what is possible, and by which we figure out how to act for it, you need to be acting for it rationally. And all of this is causal in that, it's about earning, it's about achieving, it's about creating, and paying a price is, in some cases, an instance of that, right? A literal instance of price is the thing you need to create and give someone to cause them to give you this thing in trade. And in other cases, it's a metaphor for it, where we expand beyond that literal case. But it's what the cause you need to enact or create to get the effect you want. So we get this emphasis on causality and the role that causality and an understanding of the possible plays in someone's desires. We get that in all this talk about price, which I think is, Ben, I think you're totally right about that. We get it in a few other places. There's Stadler is described as taking a shortcut, right? Good. So what's the passage there?
Pursue it. He wanted to brush people out of his path, and he never identified the means to it or the nature of his path and of his enemies. He took a shortcut.
Good. So the other, oh, sorry, I banged the microphone. The other example of this, other language we get this in then, is in terms of means and ends. You need to enact the means needed to achieve your ends. And if you're not willing to enact the means and interested in discovering what they are and so forth, then you're not really valuing the end. And it's not a real value, and it's not something that you're rationally pursuing. And Stadler didn't do that. Instead, he tried to find a shortcut around what are in fact the necessary means to his end. And so what he achieved then was not actually his end, and what he's been engaged in is a kind of faking. And we'll see
next chapter
a lot about faking and destruction as connected to Stadler at the beginning of the next chapter. The other respect in which we see Axton talking a lot about this in the same scene when he's talking about Stadler and he's talking about his students is the language of what people have achieved. And here he's using achieved in a morally neutral way, so to speak. So normally we think of achievement as something good, but he'll talk about people achieving the consequence of their ideas, right? So I'll just read. He wants Daphne to understand, quote, the full evil of those who have claimed to have been convinced that the earth is by nature a realm of malevolence where the good has no chance to win. Notice, by the way, that that's what Galt warns Daphne against coming to think after she goes back. If she finds that she can't achieve what she thinks she's going to achieve by going back, don't become convinced like them that the earth is malevolent. But let them check their premises, says Stadler. Let them check their standard of values, etc. Robert Stadler now believes that intelligence is futile and that human life can be nothing but irrational. But did he expect Galt to become a great scientist willing to work under the orders of Floyd Ferris? Did he expect this? Did he expect that? And we got another few other examples of things that it would have been unreasonable to expect. Would that have been a future in which Robert Stadler would have considered rational? I want you to observe, Miss Taggart, that those who cry the loudest about their disillusionment about the failure of virtue, the futility of reason, the impotence of logic, pause. In other words, those who cry the loudest about the fact that virtue, reason, and logic don't reach the effects that you would think they should reach, which is what Stadler is complaining about, right? Reason, it doesn't work. You can't live by reason when you deal with people. If you could, these three students would have been great, but look, one of them is a pirate and the other is a bookkeeper and a playboy. The people who cry the loudest about that are, quote, those who have achieved the full, exact, logical results of the ideas they preached, so mercilessly logical that they dare not identify it. And then we get how the things Stadler preached, right, led to the results that it led to. But the idea is that what you believe and what you act on will achieve results in the world. And Stadler believed and acted on some irrational views, thinks Axton, and he's bearing the fruit of it now. Axton continues, every man builds his world in his own image. He has the power to choose, but no power to escape the necessity of choice. If he abdicates his power, he abdicates the status of man, and the grinding chaos of the irrational is what he achieves as his sphere of existence by his own choice. Now, that's, in other words, the consequence of acting a certain way on a certain view of the world. And he goes on and on. You achieve this by doing that, and that by doing this, and the valley is what can be achieved and what the strike represents by people who, as his students did, make no concessions to the irrational. Oh, this is now we're at one of my favorite moments in this chapter, though, and it's out of line with what we're actually talking about, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. Just
Is it?
Well, it's not directly.
I'm not sure.
I love this moment. So I'll just read the quote and we'll talk about it. So he says, whoever brings him to reality a matchstick or a patch of garden made in the image of his thought, he, and to that extent, is a man, and that extent is the sole measure of his virtue. They, he pointed at his pupils, made no concessions. This, he pointed at the valley, is the measure of what they preserved and what they are. Now I can repeat my answer to the question you asked me, knowing that you will understand it fully. You asked me whether I was proud of the way my three sons had turned out. I am more proud than I had ever hoped to be. I am proud of their every action, of their every goal, and of every value they've chosen. And this, Dagny, is my full answer. Now, there's a lot that's really interesting about this passage. First of all, you have to keep in mind the all these people adhere rigidly to you don't call people by their first names except when you're have a certain kind of familiarity with them that Axton doesn't have yet with Dagny. Right, we're in a very casual culture, so everyone's by their first name, and we say Pooja said on the chat and Benjamin said on the chat, not Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, which is what would be the more formal way, and how Axton would have referred to people in his classes, I'm sure, and so forth. But Axton is a father to these three students, which is why they're John and Ragnar and Francisco, and in calling Dagny, he's accepting her as, in effect, Galt's wife, right, or anyway, Galt's choice, and that's why I'm proud of their every action, their every goal, and of every value they've chosen. In other words, I'm proud of Galt having chosen you, Dagny, who I'm now calling Dagny and admitting as part of our circle and as part of my family. And he's saying this knowing that she will understand it fully. Now, that's again an example of the kind of thing I talked about with Galt and Dagny, of the kind of intellectual level of the conversation and the kinds of connections move quickly. And Dagny, of course, immediately gets this and experiences this way, right? The sudden sound of her first name was pronounced in the tone of a father. He spoke his last two sentences looking not at her, but at Galt. So at one level, he's answering Daphne's question, but what he's doing is saying, Galt, I know you want Daphne, and she's your choice of what you want out of life and who you want out of life, and I accept and endorse it. And then,
so he's basically just married them.
right, in effect, he's married them or pronounced that they're the one for each other, and acknowledging that they think that. And Galt and Daphne understand everything that's going on in this moment, and Axton, and no one else does. Axton's very quick. And what's interesting here is the whole of, and this is, what's so personal about the book. She saw Galt answering him by an open glance that held steady for an instant like a signal of affirmation. That's how Galt and Axton communicate, right? Because they're on this, they each have this kind of insight into what's going on that other people, I think, don't have in general, because there's a kind of sharpness and acuity they have that's distinctive to them, even among these very smart people. And then, of course, Galt knows what's going on, and Axton has guessed it, though the others don't. Then Galt's eyes moved to hers. She saw him looking at her as if she bore the unspoken title that hung in the silence between them, the title Dr. Axton had granted her, but had not pronounced, and that none of the others has caught. She saw in Galt's eyes a glance of amusement at her shock, of support, and incredibly of tenderness. That's just a really interesting touch, right? So Galt understands what this moment means to her. He understands the way in which it's a little difficult to her. There's also so many aspects of this moment, like both the idea that in a way she's his wife, and that's a difficult thing to bear, and also that, the sense of like, this is what it's like being with my people. This is how we interact. This is what Axton's like, and so forth. And Axton is a sort of, in a way, a stern teacher, right? And Galt is the sternest of teachers, so thinks Francisco. But there's this kind of style to them. And I think, there's philosophical significance, but just a lot of personal distinctiveness to the characters. And I don't think that kind of, if this was Daphne falling in love with Francisco, it would not be written this way. And Axton accepting that. There's just a lot of coloring to the characters. It's hard to articulate why it has to be this way, just like it's hard to articulate why a certain action is characteristic of a certain person in real life. And that's because these characters aren't just embodiments of abstractions walking around, although there are abstractions that are part of their characterization. They have all these individuating touches.
So, Greg, I think we've got about 24 minutes left that we want to use. I think we should definitely do the benevolent universe stuff. I don't know how much time we need to spend on it, because we've kind of given it a lot of its flesh at this point. But we should at least, I think we should turn to that and then see how much time we have left for the other stuff.
Good. So why don't you start us off on that then?
Oh, you keep giving me these things that you didn't say that prepare for, but that's okay. We've been talking about this chapter. We've been talking about the chapter all week, and I think that,
and we've got these bullet points we can both see.
So there's a concept in Rand's philosophy which is not named explicitly in this chapter, or I think really anywhere in the book, if I'm right, Greg. That she calls the benevolent universe premise. But if you didn't know about that concept, you'd hopefully still be struck by a number of different things that are happening in this chapter that I think help add up to it. I mean, the opening scene of the chapter, the first paragraph after the good morning, in the windows behind him, the mountains had the tinge of a silver pink, which seems brighter than daylight, with the promise of a light to come. The sun had risen somewhere over the earth, but it had not reached the top of the barrier, and the sky was glowing in its stead, announcing its motion. She had heard the joyous greeting to the sunrise, which was not the song of birds, but the ringing of the telephone a moment ago. She saw the start of a day, not in the shining green of the branches outside, but in the glitter of chromium on the stove, the sparkle of a glass ashtray on a table, and the crisp whiteness of his shirt sleeves. And I think that's a really nice touch as a way of opening a chapter that is otherwise has a lot to do with the topic of whether we live in a universe where values are achievable. And it's a question that Dagny herself has been struggling with. It's the question she's been struggling with in all of her thinking about Atlantis, which we talked a little bit about in our main episode earlier this week, where she's got this courage and integrity to pursue her values, but at times she's tempted by the idea that it's for nothing and that it'll come to nothing, but she'll struggle anyway. And so she's got this integrity, but in thinking that, she's got this kind of malevolent attitude. And actually, benevolent universe doesn't happen in the chapter. We do hear, and you mentioned it before, Axton characterizing the view that is often ubiquitous in the outside world, that values aren't achievable.
Yeah,
and go ahead.
Just outside of Rand's writing, the phrase malevolent universe, or the word malevolent associated with universe, is more common than the phrase benevolent associated with universe. And
makes sense.
Maybe because people view the universe more that way, or for whatever reason. But in the companion, the last chapter, by the companion I mean this book, a companion to Ayn Rand, co-edited by Alan Godhelf, who I mentioned earlier, and myself. And the last chapter of the book is called is about. It's called Hallmarks of Objectivism, the benevolent universe premise and the heroic view of man. And so it's half about this benevolent universe premise, and that chapter is written by me and Alan. And we trace her use of this language, among other things, and explain the premise itself and what role it plays in her thought. But one of the things that we learned in doing that is the idea of other people had used the phrase benevolent universe before her. It's unclear whether she had read any of their uses of it, but the phrase malevolent universe was in much wider use. And so, it's pretty easy, if you know the phrase malevolent universe and you want the opposite of it, to think, well, the opposite would be a benevolent universe. It might be that she and other people made that opposition independently, or she might have heard people using it. But it fits with that whole trajectory that we should find the universe described as malevolent, in the view that Axton and Dagny and others are rejecting, more than we find benevolent in the view she's accepting.
And the first explicit discussion of this question in the chapter is, of course, when Ragnar shows up, and Dagny's looking at how beautiful he is, and then realizing that he's a pirate once she finds out that it's Ragnar, and when she finds out that he's married to Kay Ludlow, who's this beautiful movie star. How can she stand it to lose you to the world for such a time when you are in danger of being killed? And
there's an example
Ragnar's
for Benjamin's thesis about equality: the two most beautiful people are married.
Yeah, and his answer to her is that we don't believe that the earth is a realm of misery where man is doomed to destruction. We're free to fight suffering when it arises, when we have specific reason to think that it could happen. And I think that the perspective that we've been discussing throughout the episode tonight is what informs this. The reason that there's no reason to think that we're doomed to suffering is because we are capable of understanding cause and effect connections in reality. And when we figure out what we need to get what we want and what we need to avoid what we don't, if we figure it out and we work at it, we can do it. And the reason that people think otherwise is because they, as you've emphasized, they think of the irrational as possible and include destruction in their conception of the practical. And in the world that we're now, that's being portrayed in this book, those people have been given an undue amount of influence because they've been aided by those who have discovered things about the world and who have the power that comes through the discovery of cause and effect. And they've taken it as the unearned, and the creators and the producers have given it to them without having earned it. And that's, of course, the big reason why Galt wants Dagny to leave that world and to come to live with them in this valley where you can deal with people as you would deal with the rest of nature, and people obey cause and effect and can be dealt with in terms of cause and effect. And that's one of the big reasons why there's stress throughout this chapter on the kind of spirit of youth. And Dagny is seen by Galt and others as childlike and youthful, and she looks like a schoolgirl. She thinks back to her time when she's at Rockdale. When she gets the job from him, she trembles with the hope of a young girl in her first job. Dagny, Francisco says that he wants to fight. The reason that he goes on strike is to fight for any child who has Dagny's look as she looks to the future, the way she looks when she gets up in the morning, which is something that Galt says he knows what she looks like. She's described as his servant girl. We, of course, get a whole description of the two children who are in the valley, the baker's children, and how Dagny recaptures a sense of her own childhood by seeing them at play in a world where they don't have to expect the irrational because their mother is raising them to be rational beings. There's all kinds of this stuff. And that connects somewhat to the question maybe we might still talk about later about why there aren't more children. But
a few just advertising my book. Not only that though, there's we talk a lot about this, Alan and I, in this chapter, a lot of connections to Atlas and Rand's other novels, and one of the things we do is let me see if I have a good quote on what the benevolent universe premise is, but it's the conviction that well, I'll just here's a passage. I know that pain is to be fought and thrown aside, not to be accepted as a part of one's soul and as a permanent scar across one's view of existence. That's something Galt says a little bit later in the novel, but it's of, later than where we are, but it's of a piece with what Ragnar's saying, right? This idea that the normal and what existence is and your view of existence is as a place where, as a character in another one of her novels says, so much is possible. And this is, we talked about it 2 sessions ago, the point of we never had to take any of it seriously, did we? No, we never had to. What we never had to take seriously was ugliness and suffering, right? Despair, the idea that these things are metaphysically important, that they're what the world and life is about. And so the benevolent universe premise is the idea that the world is a place in which achievement is possible to human beings, in which happiness is possible, and in which we can expect that if we act rationally. And what we do is, in the chapter, we talk about how this view flows out of some of the theses of Rand's philosophy and of Galt's philosophy. And we have a paragraph each on several theses, and I'm just going to read you the theses without the paragraphs. This is on page 458 of the companion. A is A, that things have a definite identity with definite causes and effects. And this is, of course, something we've been seeing a lot of in this chapter. And A is, of course, the title of this section of Atlas Shrugged. And we'll hear more about that formulation, A is A, when Galt makes his larger speech later. The idea that man is a rational being. The idea that, as Galt puts it in his later speech, man's a being of volitional consciousness. The idea that there's a morality of reason with man's life as its standard of value. That quote is also from Galt's later speech, but that idea we've seen in what Francisco has been telling Reardon all this time. And then finally, from the theme that we're just looking at, that there are no conflicts of interest among rational men. And we talk a bit about how each of those contributes to this view of the world. So for those of you who have that book, now might be a good point to look at that. Now in reading Atlas might be a good point to review that chapter. And the book's a bit pricey, but I recommend it for people who are interested in Rand's views.
And all of this relates to one of the discussion questions which we asked, which is what kind of people do the residents of the valley consider normal, and what kind of life do they consider natural? We just talked about what kind of life they consider natural. That, of course, then has implications for what kind of people seem normal. And there's a scene, of course, the same scene you were just talking about before with Axton at his house and his students in the backyard, I think. And Stadler says, these are normal men, which is a sort of paradoxical sounding way of putting it when you think about who these people are. And so why is he saying that? And we asked this question, and in the discussion board, Keith said, normal here doesn't mean typical, ordinary, commonplace, but acting in accordance with their nature. And that is a sense of normal as in the sense of living up to the norms of, in this case, the species. And the norm of the species is to rationally identify your place in the universe and to figure out how to live there. And that is why they've been able to get to where they are. They've paid the price that they figured they needed to pay and chosen their values on the basis of that. And that makes them normal in the relevant sense. They're not typical or ordinary or commonplace, but that's because too many people in the outside world aren't abiding by the norms of their species, and we see the result. Greg, you still there? I hear you. Well, Greg has stepped out for a moment.
Sorry, I'm here. Are you not hearing me?
Yeah, I do now.
Okay. Sorry, I'd the mic was set up different. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Also, by way of advertising, there's a fair amount about this heroic view of man and normalcy and heroism, also in that last chapter of The Companion. This is also not the only time in Atlas that we get this idea. One scene that I really like, or one description I really like, this is in chapter 5, I guess, and it's we've gotten Francisco, the backstory, chapter 5 of part 1. We've gotten the backstory of Dagny and Francisco, and now Dagny's going to see Francisco for the first time in the Wayne Falkland, and it switches to describing Francisco, right, as Dagny's about to walk in, and it says whether he's handsome and so forth, but it says, people described him as having the vitality of a healthy animal, but they knew dimly that wasn't right. I might not be quoting exactly as I'm doing it from memory, but he had the vitality of a healthy animal, people described him. People knew dimly that wasn't right. What he had was the vitality of a healthy man, something so rare that people didn't know how to describe it. And that's he had the vitality of a healthy human being, a thing so rare that no one could identify it. He had the power of certainty. And so that's, again, he's normal. He's like a healthy human being. And, that's something people don't even know how to recognize. And,
the two boys that are the sons of the baker woman right. are described sort of in a similar way. They had the open, joyous, friendly confidence of kittens who did not expect to get hurt. They had an innocently natural, non-boastful sense of their own value and an instant trust in any stranger's ability to recognize it.
Yeah, Amish has been pointing out in the forums a couple of cases where descriptions or metaphors that Ayn Rand would later use in other contexts come up in Atlas.
And that's the Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, he pointed out this one, that she describes Marilyn Monroe as kitten-like in this way, the same way. And I think that's true.
She did like cats.
What is going on
we've got about
discussion? Tears of joy.
There's a discussion about tears of joy, and someone asked about whether or not tears of joy are an expression of malevolent universe. And I mean, from what I understand, Rand did have the view that they were, because when somebody cries at a wedding, for instance, they're looking at this as an exceptional case. Why can't the rest of the world be like this? And because otherwise it is something that seems to require explanation. Why would you cry at a otherwise happy event?
Well,
I don't know if I agree with that, but that's the view I've heard attributed to her.
I've also heard that attributed to her. I mean, that's taking it for granted that crying is a natural response to a sad thing and an unnatural response to a happy thing. And so we have to understand how the happy thing is seen as alike to sadness. And if that's how we understand crying, that's one way of explaining it, maybe the only way in that case. You might think, though, and this is Laura, or somebody was suggesting this, that maybe crying is just, or maybe Pooja was suggesting this, that maybe crying is a response to being overwhelmed by
Any kind of emotion.
yeah. And if you had that view, then there'd be no special thing to explain as to why you would cry at a wedding. And even if you don't think that, I mean, you might think, although the world is not malevolent, that nevertheless, certain kinds of great things are rare, and there's can be some kind of sadness maybe associated with that. Um, I mean, that's not how Dagny would view it, I think, and so I don't think it's how Rand views. But anyway, this is what crying denotes and the psychology of tears and such is a big question. So,
but I think that we've got about 6 minutes left, so I think we should try to wrap up by hitting the point about spiritual trade and the chapter title.
Okay.
As much as I might want to talk about some of those other things.
Go
So maybe just talk about the title first. I mean, so it's called The Utopia of Greed. And one of the things that I noticed on this reading was that the word greed only really appears like 1.5 times in the whole chapter. And the most significant use is in that passage that we read earlier where Dagny says that she's paying this price now. She doesn't know whether she'll earn enough to hold the title, but if hell is the price and the measure, let me be the greediest of the three of us. So, I mean, one thing to observe is that this is a unconventional usage of the word greed because you typically associate that word with people who just grab whatever they like, regardless of the cost or regardless of the consequence. And yet Dagny's cognizant of both of those here and is even treating it as a measure of her greed. She wants these things so badly for what they really are that she knows the price that she has to pay and is willing to go for them. And so that's one point, that greed is associated with recognition of cause and effect. But then I also think it's really interesting that throughout this chapter, the examples of things that people are greedy for is of a decidedly different cast than what you'll typically associate with the objects of greed. I mean, you'll typically think people are greedy for money and material wealth. And this chapter, the utopia of greed that's portrayed is people who are greedy for what Rand sometimes calls spiritual values. There's discussion of, I mean, it opens with Dagny going to a play, right, where she sees Kay Ludlow and hearing, I think this is, and hearing the concerto. It's close to it's close to the beginning at least. Hearing a concerto by Halley, and then of course there are all the different romantic conflicts or apparent romantic conflicts, and discussion of their love for each other, and the love of parents of children for their parents, both the baker for her children and then Axton for his adopted children. This isn't your typical kind of greed. This is greed for the higher values of the spirit, and there's a kind of trade for these values that's also described. Early on, we see, Galt talking about a kind of payment that husbands and wives can expect of each other, but which he doesn't yet have the right to demand. And Dagny later says she hasn't earned. And when Francisco's explaining why he doesn't think there's a conflict between him and Galt, he says that there's no conflict because our response, our love, involves a payment in answer to the same kind of values. So there's not just spiritual greed and the objects of the greed are spiritual, but there's a kind of spiritual trade that's involved. And this is pretty significant when the chapter title is The Utopia of Greed. I think the previous chapter, if anything, was a chapter about the material aspect, where you see all the different trades that people are engaging in materially, and all the ways in which they've transformed their industry from the outside world into the valley. And obviously, these are not unrelated, because Francisco explains why he gives up his company for the sake of the image that he has of Dagny, and Galt gives up his motor for similar reasons. But this is the second chapter, and it's portrayed as even more important, and that's something that has to be considered when you're thinking about what Rand means by greed and the utopia of greed.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and that there's a big emphasis here is on greed for spiritual values and on rational greed. That is, and what do I mean by it being rational? If you really want the thing and care about it, and you're a being that has the faculty of reason and that achieves things by the faculty of reason, then you don't just sit there stewing over how much you want it, and you don't just grasp at it at random, which is, Stadler is described as clutching at his children, right? But the way he actually behaves is in a way that drives them away from him. And if you were, greedy in a rational way, you wouldn't just be clutching at the things you wanted. You'd be doing what it takes to gain and keep them, and figuring out what that is. And then, of course, a lot of the values are not merely physical, not, say, merely having Dagny's physical presence in the valley, but spiritual, having the meaning of that thing. Not merely physical in the sense of having the dollar bills in your pocket or even the gold, but having what that represents and the kind of way of life that is the symbol and means of. So greed for spiritual values, greed for the spiritual meaning of the material values, and greed in being willing to do what it takes to get those values. Are there any last things we want to talk about the way of life in the valley? Ben, you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the politics of it. I think there's actually another occasion later in the book when we can talk about
I think we should hold on to
that. And
later.
in particular, we can talk about it when we think about, which we'll have occasion to later, and maybe even after the end of the book, when we think about what the strikers expect to happen at the end if they're successful with their strike. So I think we can talk about that in that context. People have brought up several times the issue of children. We don't see a lot of children in the book or in any of Rand's fiction. That's only sort of true, right? We see many of our main characters as children. Dagny and Eddie and Francisco we see as children. And we see these two children in the valley. What we don't see in the book is the heroes themselves having children, expressing a desire to have children, although the hero of the novel Anthem does. But we don't see the heroes expressing a desire to have children or having children. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that in order to make the plots maximally dramatic, she has the characters, for the most part, be single and meeting each other and falling in love with each other. So they're typically not at the stage of life where they might have children already. And then the characters who are at the stage of life where they might have children already, characters like Axton, who could have a wife and children, and maybe they're there with him in the valley or whatever, well, they're minor characters who are supporting characters to the main young, not yet in committed relationships characters. And to give those supporting characters, wives and children, or husbands and children in the case of the female ones, would be adding a lot of extra characters to the book. So if she thought it was important enough to show family life, then she would have done that. But so it clearly she doesn't think it's at a certain level of importance to what she wants to say. However, she thinks it's of enough importance that she makes a point to have this mother in the valley with the two children. Now, there's another
But I
reason.
should.
Go ahead, Ben. Yeah.
I'm not sure what other reason you were about to mention was, but I do want to, before we close, comment on why people talk about this so much and why this question always comes up so much.
Yeah.
Did you want to
So
say your thing first?
no, go ahead. Mine's on that topic, but say what you want to say.
So, I mean, I agree with everything that you just said about the literary reasons why she makes this choice. But I also recommend on this particular point that people go back to the supplementary episode that we did on sex, because you made an important point there. I wasn't able to join you live, but that, you know, there are ways to have sex without having kids. Not all of them had been invented yet in 1957. Some of them had been. And I think that the people who, and I'm not saying this is true, the people who brought this up in the discussion, but some of the original sources of this worry are conservative publications who have an attitude that the purpose of sex is reproduction, and who don't think, like Rand, that sex is an expression of the joy of life and a reward for the character that entails. And I mean, what it comes down to is that when people wonder why aren't there more children, they're, I think, in effect asking, why isn't it that these characters, why don't they have to suffer the consequences that the rest of us who have a million children are willing to put? I mean, it comes down to a hatred for sex. It comes down to a hatred for sex as an end in itself.
Well, that's if they dislike
which is not
kids.
to say,
I mean,
to say that you can't have good reasons for raising children, and you see characters in the Valley doing this.
So there's a worry that sex shouldn't be decoupled from the responsibilities of child rearing, and I do think you get that from a lot of the conservative people who make this point. I think there are two other related reasons why people are interested in whether there are children in the novels. One of them is that when you're saying you should live selfishly, you should live for yourself, one thing in life that seems to be unselfish for a lot of people and is often given as a model of unselfishness is having children, and the things you do for your children. And now, if you say be selfish, you don't have to have children. And so it can be a selfish choice, a choice in lines with Rand's philosophy, not to have kids, or on the other hand, to have kids, and you shouldn't feel some obligation to have kids. That seems like the kind of thing Rand would say, and it's definitely true, I think. You shouldn't feel an obligation to have kids. It's bad for the kids and bad for you. But if you thought, well, it couldn't be selfish to have kids, this kind of a life that's greedy, that's selfish, that's rational, that's productive, a life lived in accordance with Rand's and Galt's and Dagny's values, is incompatible with raising kids, well, then that would be strange. I mean, it would be a reason to think this view can't be true, because human beings can't exist unless some of them have kids, right, to keep the species going. And a view of life that was incompatible with reproduction couldn't be a right philosophy of life. So if we're used to thinking of relationships to children as sacrificial, as non-selfish, as something you do for them, then a philosophy in the novel that's suggesting a very different way of viewing life, that we shouldn't be sacrificial, you might wonder, well, what role then do kids play? Clearly it can't be that role. Do you think we shouldn't have them at all? Well, if we should, why should we? Who should we? How should that decision be made? And I think it's important that this mother character be put in the Valley to signal, what kinds of values a parent would have and would want in having kids. Another related thing to that is the novel has a particular view on love, which we'll see more of in the next couple of chapters. An opposition to the idea of love as unearned or causeless. Love has to be earned. And you might think, well, how could that apply to a parent's love of a child who, comes in the world having not yet earned anything, and yet the parents seem to love it? And so, again, in connection with the view of love in the novel, you might think children are a kind of interesting or special case of that. And even if you don't, hate sex or whatever, you might be curious about how Rand and these characters would deal with that aspect of life, and you might see it as a potential objection that's not coming from a place of hating sex, but coming from a place of here's an important part of life, and I don't see how this philosophy would account for it. Now, I think
I agree that is a completely valid reason for asking the question, though I question whether the original the origin of that question comes from that motive. It usually comes from one particular article.
Yeah.
Actually.
Now I mean, so I think it's significant that Rand saw the need to put children into this valley for just this purpose, to say, I think there's a way in which this can be selfish and so forth. I think she could have, if she were a different person with a different set of values personally, written a novel like this that had a lot more about kids. They've written other novels that had a lot more about kids. And I mean, she chose not to have kids herself. So she's not someone who was personally so into parenting. And if she was, she would have, written novels that played a bigger part in, I think.
Yeah.
She might have.
And that's interesting because probably a big part of the reason why she didn't want to have kids was because she was pregnant with her novels, and those were her children. And I suspect that the reason why it can be selfish to have children is in large part, I think it's similar to the role that the artist plays in relation to the artwork. There's a kind of control that you want to exercise over a certain kind of product. Now, it's a product with free will, and that complicates things. But you want to have your values reflected, and you're trying to instill them, and you want to see. It's a lot about experiencing your own youth, and trying to make it better than what you started. But that's a conversation for another day, and we're already 10 minutes over.
Outside of the scope of the book, but neither of us have the experience of having them and can speak to that. Although there are, Yaron has spoken, and Robert Mayu and Leonard Peikoff, and they're different shows at different times. Leonard has, I think, some podcasts about this, about Leonard Peikoff, for people who don't know, since we're on the Atlas Shrugged page, and it's some people just like the novel and aren't students of it. These people, Leonard was Ayn Rand's kind of best and longest term student and her heir, and wrote a book called Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, then was a teacher to many of us, both some classes some of us took with him. I only had one short class with him, and through his work. And Leonard is sorry, my wife just texted me something I'm confused about connected to this.
He's the preeminent scholar on Ayn Rand.
And anyway, Leonard has a daughter, and spoke a bit in various places about his reasons for wanting to have a kid and what the joys and challenges of it are. Okay, so that's it for today. We will join you. We'll join you guys again on Tuesday, when I'll be back in New York, but with some different bits of technology that'll hopefully make the internet connection go more smoothly. And we'll be talking about Chapter 3, Anti-Greed, so the opposite of the Utopia of greed, right?
All right.
Thanks
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.